Earlier today, Bebe had posted a pretty controversial tweet talking about what he believes is the wasted resources within teamfight tactics, specifically attacking the balance team. I will link his original tweet in the description below, but I do want to provide my own opinion on the matter because I do find it quite interesting. Now, before we go over each of his talking points, I'd just like to point out that I am not a better player than Bebe. He is a much more dominant player than I am, and he's played for much longer than I have, and I think that despite the fact that I do not agree with the majority of what he has to say, I am not trying to attack him in any way. I'm just providing my own additional context and opinions on the topic. Please keep in mind that some of the frustrations stem from years of feeling frustrated about TFT Korea in general, which unfortunately we will not cover in today's video because there is quite a lot. And while some of his expressions and responses were inexcusable, I understand that he deeply does care for the well-being of teamfight tactics and really does want to succeed much more than most do. I do have some level of understanding as to where all of this is coming from. Finally, we will not be covering every single point made in his tweet because quite honestly, the tweet itself is a bit all over the place and some of it is just straight up fluff. To be honest, no one cares what you did in high school, bro, just leave it out. Bebe's first talking point is about how he believes that the balancing team in TFT, if balancing is all they do, they are a waste of money. The main reason stated is that they patch TFT biasly towards their own preferences and not based on the majority, ruining the gameplay experience. Personally, I do not agree with this sentiment at all, and in fact I believe it's quite the opposite. The TFT balance team balances the game around a lot of specifically core principles and are limited by a lot of things that are outside of their control. This has stayed true and incredibly consistent, at least for the entirety of the time I've started taking TFT more seriously since around set 7. Some of these principles include making sure reroll, leveling, and fast 9 are all valid ways of approaching the game. The ideal being that at least 3 comps can use each cost of a carry at the highest level. The balance team held a panel at Vegas talking about these core principles, and some of the slides can be found on Twitter, which I will link in the description below. This is just one example. It also does not help that because TFT is ingrained into the absolute spaghetti dookie salad that is the League of Legends client, that TFT is forced to patch almost a whole 2 weeks before it's deployed. As you can see in the timeline of a patch slide here from the Vegas Open Balance team panel, all text changes for the next patch are finalized within 2 to 3 days after the most recent patch just hit the live servers. You can ask any high-level player, but that is not nearly enough time to figure out what is even meta for the most recent patch, let alone have a strong enough understanding to know what needs to be buffed and or nerfed by the next patch. For most players, including myself, it usually takes at least 3 to 5 days before the meta starts to settle, and that's after the whole world has gotten a few days to play on the new patch, alongside all the stats that come out on augment selections, compositional stats, unit stats, etc. on the most recent patch. While the very common counter argument is why not just develop a new client, from speaking with writers personally, they've all expressed how this task itself is a monumental task that would not only take years, but way too much funding to even be considered financially realistic. Now, personally speaking, I think with how transparent the balance team has been about their constraints and how they operate, I'd even argue it's one of the best selling points of TFT as a whole. How many other games have such a transparent relationship with its own development team? Not trying to glaze here, but I think they're doing the best they can given their circumstances. But there is some semblance of truth to what Bebe is saying in his second point, where he states that the balancing has been receiving bad feedback for years, not just a day or two, and a lot of people have just given up because they seem hopeless. Now, it's true that they've received some bad feedback for things like the Draven patch, multicaster patch, war week, etc. And it's also true that some people have given up on the balancing team because at times it can seem hopeless when the game becomes unplayable, for example, the Draven patch. But the team has also shown that they're willing to take more and more immediate action when things go awry. They'll be patched when necessary and step in if emergency patches are required. The Draven patch lasted a day. With the constraints that they're given, I think those who have given up on the balancing team or view them as hopeless have done a very shallow job at actually looking into how much effort the balancing team has consistently put into the game every set. Bebe then talks about what he believes is the most important factor as to why he believes the balancing team is a waste of money, where he says that TFT balancing does not cater to skilled players or casual players, meaning it's neither fun nor competitive. He goes on to further elaborate that TFT fundamentally cannot be a skilled game or a competitive game. This is because fairness is a core part of competition, and if 2 people start the same game and are offered different resources not on their abilities but by pure luck, such a game is not competitive. I would argue this is just inherently incorrect. League of Legends, one of the most dominant esports in history, has shown that statistically there's a slight advantage when starting blue side versus red side. In chess, one of the most competitive and timeless sports of human history, has shown that at the highest level, playing as white is slightly more advantageous compared to playing as black. Games can be competitive even if both sides of the opposition are at slight disadvantages. TFT is definitely a competitive game. You can definitely low roll your openings, but controlling the variance that the game provides is what makes the game competitive. As a player, creating opportunities for lucky chances is a highly expressive skill. It's also the reason why a lot of top players will yap about having strong fundamentals, because with solid fundamentals, you can maximize the number of opportunities in your games to be lucky. But with that being said, there is again some semblance of truth to what Bebe is saying. TFT right now is at a crossroads. Do we try to balance the game for the competitive scene, or do we try to balance the game for what is considered more fun? Right now, it seems that the team is trying to do both at the same time, which causes this dissonant dichotomy. But my question is, why can't both exist? Which leads me to Bebe's final talking point, where he references the silent majority. He references the silent majority as the vast amount of players who are playing the game casually and are most likely working full-time jobs, are in school, or have other commitments. He states that these types of players generally have the following opinions. A. I love rerolled decks. B. I don't really care about the patch, don't even read them. C. I like TFT because of the various strategies it provides, but I hate forcing something. Besides the fact that points A and C can be slightly conflicting, and even if we were to assume that these points are all inherently true, which personally speaking, I just believe point C isn't, from my understanding, a lot of forefront players actually enjoy forcing specific comps. I even have a friend of mine named Mikey who refuses to play any unit with less than 2000 HP. But with that being said, I do not agree that you should cater towards the silent majority. To strengthen my point, I want to take a look into old school RuneScape as a case example. A game that while still has incredibly outdated in-game mechanics, janky graphics, and click to continue text panels, there's still a game that's not only lasted over 20 years, but still has to this day a very dedicated player community with rising numbers every year, alongside it a very transparent moderator team. You can even think of Mod Ash as the Mort Dog of RuneScape. But back in 2012, RuneScape had faced a crisis after a major update known as the evolution of combat. In this update, RuneScape tried to cater towards their silent majority of MMORPG players by introducing a completely different combat system that was much more similar to World of Warcraft, and also tried to introduce massive graphical updates to appeal to newer casual players. And while these updates may seem harmless and great for the longevity of the game, instead it was met with massive in-game riots where players would attempt to crash servers and for the vast majority of players completely quit RuneScape. This led to one of the largest drops in player numbers history, with almost half the player base quitting because RuneScape tried too hard to cater towards their silent majority and not the dedicated. While this is a largely gross oversimplification of the nuances behind the actual update itself, the main message is still very clear. I believe that the dedicated players are the players who keep the game alive, create content and hype for the game, and their influence largely impacts the longevity of a game. My stance is that while the game should ideally be balanced for both player bases, I believe balancing the game with the intention of leaning more towards the competitive balance would be the most ideal for the longevity of teamfight tactics. Most of the dedicated creators are high elo, and the vast majority, at least from what I can tell, prefer the game when it's most balanced and skill expressive, hence the overall success of set 10. As for catering towards the more casual player base, I think that's an area where cosmetics, arena skins, cutscenes, and game modes like Fortune's Favor are much more significant. It does not impact how the game is balanced, and I do not believe that the game should be balanced around this quote-unquote silent majority. I'd love to hear your opinions on the matter and whether or not you agree or disagree with either me or Bebe. Please keep it civil, and once my throat recovers, I will see you all soon with more YouTube videos and streams. Until then, happy climbing.